Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker. Super excited to be with you tonight. Very excited to have an interview happening tonight on the topic of privilege awareness. But before I go into that very much, I just want to give a little bit of a shout out to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. I have been trying to run this podcast for many years. It requires listener support, which usually means some type of financial donation. And you can go to mormonmentalhealth.org to very easily become either a one-time donor or an ongoing kind of recurrent donor. Anything helps. So, if you can throw a few bucks our way, it sure helps with making the podcast financially viable. I usually tell people it takes about $5,000 a year to keep this a financially viable podcast. We barely make it every year, even though we have thousands and thousands of people listening to it. So, if everybody just would donate $1, we would get there no problem. Some of you do already donate on a regular basis, and I just want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. This is a super important pet project of mine. I really believe in it. I think it's such an important resource in our community, and I always get really super wonderful feedback about it. So I just would ask for your support, especially now that I'm bringing on some more hosts, and I would love to be able to give them a small stipend for their time when they run some of these podcasts for me. So that would be just, I think, good practice, good business. I don't know, something like that. So please help me out. If you can't financially support us, but still value the content and want to be able to do something, other great ways to support us is to share the content. So like it on Facebook, like our Facebook page, let your friends and family know about it. Share it on your Facebook or Instagram pages, and, just give us a good review. Things like that make a lot of difference, both on Apple iTunes and or on the Facebook pages. When you leave reviews, that makes a huge difference. So those are all ways that you can help Mormon Mental Health Podcast kind of, truck along. All right. So moving on to our guest today, I am super excited to bring back now who I can call Dr. Jimmy Bridges to the show. Jimmy has been working with me at my online practice called Symmetry Solutions for a little over a year now. Is that correct, Jimmy? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
And he has just been nothing but a beautiful asset to our practice. He just is such a thoughtful individual. His work has really been in several areas that I just find really interesting and useful to both LGBTQ kinds of things that he's presented on before and that I've shared some of his content with before. And now his dissertation was all about privilege awareness, and I really want to talk about that. I also wanted to just introduce Jimmy tonight as one of our hosts for Mormon Mental Health. He has agreed to help me come up with podcast material and be one of the people who shares content here. So Jimmy, welcome back.
Thank you
so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So tell us all about you, first of all, since we're introducing you. Tell us, who is Dr. Jimmy Bridges?
Oh gosh.
I know I'm embarrassed.
Someone who's not used to that title.
Well, you just defended your dissertation, so congratulations.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess a I'll start academically and then go personally.
Love it.
Did my bachelor's in family studies at Brigham Young University, Idaho, up in Rexburg, the Rexburg bubble. Then I went to Manhattan, Kansas to do my master's in couple and family therapy, and then stayed here to do my PhD, and had really, really neat opportunities to develop as a licensed or as a couple and family therapist, and a lot of great training here. And then had really neat opportunities to be involved in some of the researchers in Utah doing a lot of great work around the queer Mormon and post-Mormon community. So that's been fun. Personally, I joined the church, the LDS church, when I was 19 and served a mission in Tempe, Arizona. I came back and met who is now my wife, and we had a child in 2015, and our first year here in Kansas. And then through the program, the graduate program, we're going to talk about it a lot today, because the research of privilege awareness is kind of me search, was my journey as well. That the more I learned about families, the more I learned about society and inequality and power and privilege and oppression, the more I saw my own kind of paradigm shift and change. And that also influenced how I saw my own spirituality and role in the church, and transitioning out of the church, but still feeling like I needed to give back has always been, a part of how I view my role and what that time as Mormon meant to me. Now it means giving back and finding ways to just uplift and help people along their journey, whatever that might be, to live congruently, to flourish and thrive, however they need to do that, individuals, couples, and families. So that's kind of the professional and the personal. Really, it's hard to tease out at this point.
Right? Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point where I don't know that any of us who go into the field of psychology can completely not have that affect our spiritual journeys, our religious journeys, our just kind of humanistic journeys, right? So I can totally understand that. So when you say that this privilege awareness kind of journey became me centric, tell me a little bit more about that. What was that like for you?
So I think like I think like being exposed to the other was a part of this. Like my exposure to different ways of being, different ways of thinking, different ways of living, and we all kind of experience this in life. We're not, no one's really isolated from people living differently, and sometimes that, we look at that and then we have this kind of experience. This was mine, where I started thinking like, why does that person behave or look or think or act a different way? And that's really, I think, where it all starts. I think back to like experiences that I had as a white person, as a person who grew up in a pretty rural, white, kind of middle classy area, with a French mom, with Japanese cousins and an uncle. Um, I think back to all these like culturally dissonant experiences where I was exposed to a very different way of being or thinking. And that made me, that ended up leading to me thinking about my own identity. And it helped me. And then I started to realize, especially when I was just becoming more aware of, um, sexuality and gender and sexual minorities, gender minorities, that really, like, earlier in life really introduced me to the idea that, oh, people are treated differently based on how they look or based on how they live. Um, and I am coming to this understanding kind of later. Why is that? Why is it that I haven't suffered or been given the struggles that some of these other folks that are different than me have? Why was it a little easier for me to get to where I am? And along with that came, like, my own experiences of a lot of different feelings come up when you realize you've had privilege that were unearned, things that were unearned or not given to you, but things you just had because you look a certain way. And that, like, led to a lot of just insight into how the world's structured, how society is structured.
Yeah. So I think about like when I was going to school 25 years ago, I think now, we definitely talked about racism. We talked
Yep.
about cultural competency. We talked about, kind of understanding kind of family systems and marriage systems through the lens of these kinds of issues. At the same time, privilege wasn't really a word that was being used back then. And I've also noticed as I've been going to, my annual conferences, my annual psychology conferences every year, that this term has really kind of come up fairly recently in the last, I would say, maybe 5 years or so. So, which is right in the middle of when you started your studies. So, can you
Hmm.
talk a little bit about maybe from an intellectual perspective or kind of academic perspective, what's been the trajectory of these issues in the sense of how they show up in the common narrative, the rhetoric, and also the academic rhetoric around these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's recently on my mind because I have had to like ask myself that question too. Why is it now a buzzword? Um, and W.E.B. Du Bois, I say Du Bois, Du Bois, African American intellectual. He talked about the psychological wage that um, that Black and white Americans have and differ. That there's a greater psychological wage, and this was back in 1935. So he's really who a lot of folks in like studying privilege really go back to. Um, and then like a little bit more recent reference is in 19 oh gosh 80 in the 1980s, late 1980s, where Peggy McIntosh talks about unpacking the privilege knapsack, the knapsack of privilege. And she was probably the first one to give like a really good comprehensive list of how someone who is like white or male or heterosexual, how they could really get to a good sense of what it means to be privileged, and came up with questions like, are you like, would you be embarrassed to hold the hand of the person you love in public, or do you get treated differently by a doctor because of your race? And this was new. This was like a very new kind of way to talk about diversity, because typically when we talk about that in the academic setting, we're like, let's look at all these different ways of being. And what's funny about that is like, it's typically a white, colonial, educated source doing this looking out. And that started to be challenged, I think, with privilege awareness. That kind of introduced a new way to look at diversity. So it went deeper to, yeah, we have to understand like differences and culture and skin color and sexual orientation and gender identity. That's good to understand the differences. But privilege awareness and privilege studies takes that a step further to ask the questions about why power organizes the different experiences of all these folks. Um, and I think it in a way is pushing us to be more accountable of what we mean when we say diversity, what we mean when we say multicultural. So that's kind of the academic point. It's, and that's all been kind of building over time. And this like, I can't really, I think like identity politics has really given space, and like just our understanding of oppression and society's willingness to confront like the awful things that have happened, I think has given a voice to like why we talk about this in pop culture. Also, there have been like really key figures in academics who have made this more concrete for the lay public. Robin DiAngelo is one that comes to mind. She wrote the book White Fragility. I think the like subtitle is Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, something like that. White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo. Really like in a really understandable and concrete way, broke down this idea of privilege and helped me understand that this was something that could be applied to any really identity, and it helped me be okay with the fact that things like racism are not just things that we find in the KKK or we find in skinheads or white supremacist groups, that racism is a part of the fabric of how our society is built. And it was really like eye-opening for her to normalize and to give me the ability to say there is racism in me. And that took me to a whole new level of what it meant to be aware of my privilege. And then I like could do that also with like my like transphobia and homophobia and sexism, that these are not things that awful people do. These are things that are institutionalized and socialized into all of us. And if we resist if we resist the tendency to like
To
admit,
own.
yeah, to own up to that or to label it like that, it like continues to be a blind spot. And
boy,
like,
do we, right? I mean,
yeah,
we do resist labels such as I'm a racist or I'm a homophobe or
yeah,
I'm a transphobe, or I mean,
right.
unless you don't, which is its own problem. But for
Or
most of us who
classism.
maybe see ourselves as allies or see ourselves as fairly educated or see ourselves as fair, we there's so many of us that would resist those kinds of labels. And I
Mhm.
think you hit to a point as to why that it seems cruel or it seems bad somehow, and we don't see ourselves as cruel and bad, so therefore how could we be something that we've denoted to be cruel and bad? And yet privilege is this, if I'm getting it right, which this is what you're studying, so you should talk about what privilege is. But privilege is kind of this sense of I benefit from systems that privilege me as a white person, right? Or privilege me as an educated person, or privilege me as a certain sex or gender expression, that culture has said this is the way we should quote unquote be to be accepted.
Yeah, it's I like think I apply this a lot to the clinical setting where I think I'm working with individuals to understand and have more insight into the powerful emotions that are like and the powerful like feelings that are can often be paralyzing and lead us down really dark roads, and just the awful stuff that we deal with. And a lot of like what the clinical setting is made for is to find words, find language to identify an issue and to find language for it and articulate it. And it's often the case that once that's able to happen, we have more power over it. We empower ourselves when we put language to things. And I think that applies just as well to privilege and owning our privilege and being able to say things like, yeah, there's racism in me, there's sexism in me. There's power in that because we've now identified a problem. And we have more control over how we address it, how we go about deprogramming that, because it's never going to end. I'm always going to be bombarded um, with views and values that that are homophobic, that are transphobic, that are classist or racist or sexist. Those are everywhere, and it takes an active, an intentional kind of productivity or proactivity to deprogram myself of those each day. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, what is the title of your dissertation and what were you wanting to study?
Yeah. So I specifically looked at what like were the implications clinically for therapists who were going through privilege awareness experiences. I wanted to see how their role as therapists changed as they went through their own privilege awareness experiences throughout life. And then the way that kind of this is often defined, to like just define privilege in the literature, is that it's an increased access to unearned resources that are needed to thrive or flourish, which is typically granted to certain groups or social identities that have often historically been deemed superior. And so I kind of sent out, and I think it was a bit of self-selection, folks that had gone through privilege experiences and who had kind of understood what this was about, agreed to be interviewed. So I interviewed a few couple and family therapists nationwide, and they kind of went through how their own privilege awareness experiences developed over time.
And usually research falls into two basic categories. You're either trying to replicate other research or you're trying to, like deal with a new theory or, new ideas. So how would you think about your own work in that regard?
Yeah, that's a good question. This was, well, it's like a part of this is in the literature, like education. There's a lot of like privilege awareness and privilege studies in education, but there isn't really a ton on just researchers looking at privilege awareness experiences that go past race. White racial identity and privilege is the most popular kind of topic talked about. But privilege identities, there's more than just race, like being white. And so I wanted to go past that. So this was pretty exploratory. I wasn't necessarily trying to replicate things, but just really explore this new kind of, new body of literature on, is there some consistency with like how people move through becoming more aware of their privilege? Because I had folks that identified as that were white, that were African American, that were straight, bi, queer, male, female, gender nonconforming, and all of them had, been educated.
Mhm.
So, but what I was starting to find was a kind of consistent kind of process, and bigger themes started opening up.
All right, so let's dive right into that. What
Yeah.
were the themes that you found?
So
Well, oh, sorry,
oh,
before I even go there, how large was your sample?
12. So I had 12 folks, and the interviews lasted between like 45 minutes to 90 minutes, kind of in that range. And I asked them to kind of outline a timeline of privilege awareness experiences or experiences that they had throughout their life. But I do want to say this first question that I asked just about their experiences, really I could see apply to anybody, not just therapists, because I was just asking about what privilege awareness looked like for them. And I started seeing that in my own life. I started seeing these themes come like replicated in like folks that I'd seen in clinical work, folks coming to like a faith transition, like that some experiences that were culturally kind of dissonant led to big changes in their paradigm and how they saw themselves and their identity. So I want to say that before. The first big theme was just this idea that there were these experiences of exposure where there was some kind of event or material or closeness to like diverse populations that set off different kinds of emotions and feelings. Um, so a lot of this was like folks looking back on those experiences. I'll give you kind of an example, I guess. One individual had identified a podcast, Pod Save the People, um, talking about slavery and the residual effects of slavery in the current day. Other folks talked about, there was someone who was LDS and talked about the mission in Central America and the proximity to different races, different cultures, different ethnic groups, different class, like seeing class, seeing poverty. So these kind of exposure events often led to feelings, a lot of different kinds of feelings. And this was, I would say, replicated in the literature when folks are introduced to a very different kind of way of being, and they start to kind of consider the differences, especially in terms of like class and the different ways people are treated, things like discomfort, anger, shame, um, fear, anxiety, and compassion and empathy as well. Um, those kind of feelings were pretty common. And that made sense in light of like thinking, if you're exposed to a new way of thinking, a new way of being for the first time in like your young adult life or even adolescence, those can be pretty ground shaking, kind of disorienting experiences. And it was easy for me to connect this with clients that I've seen to the experience of being introduced to a new kind of idea theologically, or a new kind of, or just being exposed to the treatment of sexual or gender minorities. So that came up in this because there were a number of folks who identified as straight. And one of the individuals talked about their neighbor's house being vandalized when he, as a kid, and then asking about it and learning that his neighbor was gay, and that it was for that reason that his house was vandalized. So there's this first kind of early experiences of coming to an understanding that people are treated differently based on just how they look, how they live. A pretty disorienting kind of way, especially if you're the one who holds an identity that is treated or seen as superior. And that's where often like the guilt or the shame, the discomfort kind of would come in, is realizing that.
So meaning as a privileged little white girl, I'm going around my life thinking things are pretty fair and even keeled
Yeah.
and good for everybody, that everybody else's experience is kind of like mine. And all of a sudden I'm faced with something that happens that I maybe observe or witness that doesn't fit that paradigm that I'm living in. And now I'm having to confront that reality of that shift. And that forces me to either move into new spaces of awareness, and or I'm guessing the other thing that can happen is the backfire effect, which is I can go backwards into a more maybe staunch investment of my position, which is I think what we see happen also, right? So
Yeah.
where privilege awareness doesn't necessarily happen.
Yeah. And it's not surprising that folks that retreat from more awareness were not a part of my study, because this was volunteer, and the folks that wanted to talk to me were those who had leaned into that self-confrontation. Yeah. That being said, though, it is this is an experience that I still want to understand, and that we all still need to understand, because like I'm talking about what you're referring to, this pushback, because there's a reality of like how much this changes your life, how much it can change your religious life when you come face to face with realities of certain people who don't identify the way you do. And when you come to the reality that people are treated very differently, and you happen to be in the group that got treated way better, and that institutions and organizations have history of perpetuating the mistreatment of people who are in minority groups. All of that comes, and maybe we realize that we, as in like us privileged folks who have more privileges than marginalizations, maybe we realize that like subconsciously. This is me, I don't know, this is like me philosophizing, that maybe there's a part of us that realizes the pain that's going to come when we confront ourselves. We realize the identity crisis that's going to happen when we lean into that. And we don't
Like
really
it
want to.
comes at a high cost. It
It
comes at an
does.
uncomfortable high cost. Not that that's fair though, right? I mean, it doesn't come at a higher cost than the people who are being marginalized,
No,
but
it
it
doesn't.
still does come at a high cost for that individual to have to face that reality, have to shift, like you're saying, either identities, ideas, behaviors,
Hmm.
community, even, you
Everything.
know, it really does mean that you're going to have to step against the flow, which is, I mean, I don't know how many advocates or revolutionaries we see throughout history that are just welcomed and enveloped by their people, right? They're usually cast out or seen as destructive or unfairly, I guess judged. We could even put Jesus in that category, right? As far
Yeah,
as Mhm.
right. Yeah, it was interesting to see like uh, when people did lean in to it and allow it to change kind of who they were, how they um, saw their own privileges, how they saw others, just like the abilities that they had to reflect on the world in a different way. So I have like an example of one person who identified what this really meant on a logistical level. And if I could share their direct quote, I'm not going to give any identifying information, but
I would love that.
yeah, this was white individual, heterosexual woman. She said that talking about privileges that were became a little easier to see. She says that the Walgreens down the street from us is not a great Walgreens, but it's the most convenient place to get prescriptions. And so I have multiple times seeing people be stopped for having large bags in there to be searched, usually people of color. And I go in with my large bag all the time to get my prescriptions, and nobody bothers me because I'm this, quote, nicely put together white lady. And they don't assume that I'm there to steal. And I think about that every time I go in there with my large bag. I'm like, yeah, nobody's going to bother me because of the way I look. So it was like the more folks leaned into this, the more capacity, the greater capacity they had to be sensitive of what the world really was like and how it really was organized around differences of race and gender and sexual identity and things like that. And to speak, I think, to the maybe the church setting, because one individual was very open about how he kind of looked back to um, unintentional maybe messages that were sent through the religious community. I'll just share kind of what he said here. And this was him evaluating the past. He said, I think just larger sociocultural barriers of living in a very homogenous place kind of acted as a barrier to understanding differences, understanding my privilege. I think religious upbringing in my church created a massive barrier that it's very indoctrinated that we're all children of the same God. So I meant to believe that we all are on the same playing field. This is kind of what you were mentioning before, Natasha. We're all on the same playing field here, and I think that that's an unintentional barrier to he means to seeing my own privilege. I mean, I don't think the church is acting maliciously by any means, but it definitely creates this feeling. It doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, we're all children of God. So this was him, this individual participant, kind of evaluating a previous big organizational structure in this way of what messages is this bigger organization sending me about how I see people. And he didn't talk about that message in like in a positive light. He said this was a barrier for me seeing really how the world actually operates.
And this is where the complexity, I think, of understanding privilege comes in. Because if I can just go with that idea for a little bit, I think the thought, the principle, the belief that all are children of God can be a very beautiful belief, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it can be a belief of equality. Yet I think what he is stating here is that because he believed that, he happened to be white, he happened to grow up in a, like he's saying, homogenous culture. He then assumed that all people were having a very similar experience to him, because, we're all children of God, therefore we all must be in this together. And therefore that created blind spots for him where he might actually be part of the problem instead of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair kind of
Yeah.
just quote unquote dumbing down of that
No,
idea?
yeah, it is. And he was quick to mention how, looking back on this, how much guilt was associated with, how he made sense of that, of his position, of the role that he played and all of that. Yeah. There was another finding that was unique to the folks who, I would say, who have more visible marginalization. So folks that were people of color and folks that were identified as gender minorities. And I would like to know more about the research around this, but when I present this research or I talk about it with folks, they often ask, like, how do I make sense of like why certain privileges or marginalizations or certain marginalizations can, like, folks with marginalized identities can kind of not face too much of the brunt in society about, when it comes to oppression. So, for example, I had a few folks that identified as bisexual who talked about being able to hide that, and not experience the kind of oppression that other folks experience who maybe are lesbian or gay or gender nonconforming or trans, or people of color. So anyway, in thinking about all this, one theme came up, and it just so happened to be folks who had more visible identities that have traditionally been marginalized. So like African American participant talked about how her own oppression as a person of color in the United States acted as like a catalyst for her recognizing her privileges. It like introduced her way earlier on than I think me and a lot of other white people to the idea that people are treated differently based on how they look. One of the unfortunate things, and the literature talks about this, the unfortunate thing about being in a privileged group is we are blind to our privilege because, it's the default way of being in society.
Mhm.
And because we get treated fairly, we are blind to the idea of unfairness. Um, so what I ended up seeing was folks who were gender queer in their expression, or people of color, talked about that their experiences of being oppressed just sensitized them to this idea that power exists and power is given or taken away from folks with certain identities.
Did you say desensitize them?
Sensitize them.
Sensitize them. Yeah. In other words, the earlier on you recognize it, probably because of a lack of privilege of your own, you can then see your own privilege in other areas of
Yeah,
life. Is
yeah,
that because we all
yeah.
have privilege in different ways,
Yep,
right? Like you can
exactly.
be a homosexual male. Well, okay, so the homosexual part of you may not be privileged, but the male part of you is privileged, right? And so we all have intersections of privilege
Right.
that show up.
Yeah.
I remember doing a privilege exercise at one of these conferences that I attended that was about cultural ethics, where they had us all stand in a room
Yep.
and you all stand in a line, and then they start asking questions. So if you come from college educated parents, right, you take a step forward. So that's a position of privilege. You enjoy privilege. So that could have been a Black person, a gay person, a white person, a brown
Right.
person, or maybe not, right? And then all kinds of things, your the color of your skin, the socioeconomics you grew up in,
Right.
whether or not you're college educated or not, all
Mm-hmm.
of these different intersections of privilege. So most of
Yeah.
us have levels of privilege somewhere along the way.
Yep.
And some of it, but many of us have more kind of quote unquote notches kind of built
Mm-hmm.
up against us in the sense of what we're talking about. So hopefully that's clarifying to the audience.
Yeah. Yeah. And teasing all that out, I mean, it gets pretty complicated, but what I think I was also trying to add to this conversation was it's different. Addressing and acknowledging your privilege and owning it and learning how to not take up so much space and provide more space for others is different than the process of understanding your identities of oppression and being empowered, and finding empowerment and in ways to heal from any oppression. Those two things, although they are impacted by the same bigger structures of power, they're very different processes. And so
Just to clarify, you're saying the parts of you that need to understand your areas of privilege and the parts of you that possibly need to empower yourself against oppression. Is that what you're saying? Those
yeah,
two different, yes.
yeah.
Mhm. For
And
example, I could, in my particular life, I would have to check my privilege in my whiteness and the fact that I'm college educated and I came from college educated parents. I still have levels of oppression I've felt as a female
right.
member of society, and ways that I've had to empower myself in regards to
Hmm.
that. Is that a good example of what you're
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, as I think about all these themes, another theme was just this idea that the process is constantly evolving. And this was a pretty advanced, mature, I think, view that a lot of these participants, because they were, I think, very far along in what this all meant to them and what that meant to their professional identity, what privilege awareness meant to them. The process of privilege awareness as something that's constantly evolving was something that came up a lot. And, it just spoke to the idea that we're never really finished. We can't be this um, culture. We never get done being culturally competent or being we're done being sensitive to social injustice. Like we
Mhm.
get it. Um, this
We're
is, I
now
think,
woke.
yeah, right.
I'm done.
I I'm so conflicted with why that word became a thing, and it makes sense why so many conservative folks make fun of it. It's so unfortunate because it's like it's
I think
a
it's a really beautiful word,
it
actually. I
is
just
no
tease it
yeah
because usually it's used against an older generation. I don't know. Like I know my kids use it against me a lot. Like, you're not woke, mom.
yeah
So I'm like,
no I know
okay.
yeah but there's it's great that there's a word for this idea of being sensitive to power and oppression and privilege. At the same time, the word implies you can get done with it.
Yeah.
You can be done with it. I don't know. I don't think we're ever done with it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that this is an ongoing evolution for sure. And so let's move into then, why does this matter?
Yeah.
So, for example, people who are listening to us, this particular study, your dissertation work was dealing with therapists. Why might it matter that a therapist is aware of their privilege?
Yeah.
Why might you want, if you're part of the public, why might you want to go to a therapist who is aware of their privilege versus one who isn't?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. So I guess I could answer this with a few themes that came up. I saw that when therapists talked about how their privilege awareness changed them and changed their professional role, a few themes came up in terms of how it changed how they thought, how they monitored kind of their own language, how they monitored how they saw someone, whether they the word we use a lot is pathologized or problematized someone's issues. So folks talked about resisting this idea of seeing someone's anxiety or trauma as just an outcome of bad choices or neglectful behavior or um, not related to other bigger structures of inequality. Instead, participants talked about their own privilege awareness influencing how they saw people's problems as more connected to the kinds of marginalization or oppression or inequality they experience because of who they were, how they identified. That the connection between society and how society treats people who aren't in the majority, that was more connected to someone's mental health and relational well-being than they previously thought.
Mm.
So they were just becoming more and more sensitized to the influence that awful narratives like sexism, racism, homophobia have on people's well-being. Another thing was just like their own awareness started to change how they acted, how they like acted in the room with clients.
Mm.
And so, like I said, changes in language. One therapist talked about, I can just go to it. She said, "So I don't say I know how you feel or I know what you're feeling. I might catch myself doing it, but I say I can relate to what you're saying in a way, but I really try hard not to say I know what you're feeling or I feel the
Mm.
same way because I don't know that." So this is how she kind of talked about how her language started to change. Also, just like changes in language for like talking about relationship, how we are connected with relationships. So using the word partner instead of spouse, husband, or wife, especially when you're working with an individual who you don't know if they're straight or not, or
Mhm.
in a marriage or in a cohabiting or dating relationship.
Mhm.
So that's kind of along that theme of just them changing how they were. Also, a lot of words like curious, being more curious with clients, being more curious with people, trying to provide a relational safe space. So being like warm, their expression of warmth to clients. Transparency also came
Mm.
up as well, how transparent they were about themselves, about their own identities. Um, this is good. One client talked about, he said oftentimes too, race would come up in session. So I'd be working with a Hispanic male or an African American male. This is a white heterosexual man saying this. So I'd be working with a Hispanic male or African American male, but it's like, I feel like it had to be said. He would say, "What is it like sitting across from a white guy in this context? You're not going to hurt my feelings, but there are things I'm missing and not getting based on what I may be blind to because of my race." So this was just one way that therapists who experienced privilege awareness and how it impacted their clinical role. One way in my wording, they stayed accountable to their values. They stayed true to like wanting to be transparent with clients, to make the more implicit more explicit, to say, I'm aware that this is impacting how I see you as a client, and I'm aware that you might have a view of the world based on your experiences that I don't really have a lot of insight into because I lived a very different life than you. So that came up a lot actually.
The willingness to just voice that in a session with a
Yeah, to own
client.
up to it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Another big change was just like bigger changes in how therapists saw like problems, how problems form, how change happens. So like their theory and approach to therapy changed in light of like their own privilege awareness. The context of the client was more considered, the context they were living in. Um, I had a participant talk about like working with Hispanic population, the immigration status of different members of the family, whether they could drive, whether they felt comfortable driving um, to the clinic in the
Mm.
city, things like that, that they were just more in tune to as privilege awareness increased. And this is really like, I think about this with my own clients. I think about this in just like for all of us, whether we're a therapist or not, that this changes how we like see the world. It's the paradigm shift. It changes how we view people, how we view problems. Um, yeah.
Mm. Go ahead. Were you going to say something else before?
Yeah, and just
Yeah.
the last main theme, like just to bring it even bigger, was that therapists talked about like actual procedural and policy changes that they'd make to their practice or how they worked. So like pro bono work, and like changes in how paperwork reflected different identities over time, and how that like more and more reflected more and more identities the more aware they became. That too made me think on a broader scale of how privilege awareness and just becoming more aware of our own identities, becoming aware of oppression and privilege really has a significant impact on how, from what I see anecdotally and clinically, it impacts kind of how we operate, how we like work even in our professional roles when we choose, when we choose to advocate or be in advocacy roles or nonprofit or volunteering in our communities. I like often see this like this preceding work of privilege awareness often results in some kind of service to the community in a way that's very sensitive to societal issues that have to do with privilege and oppression and marginalization.
Yeah. So let me talk about this from a religious perspective really fast, and you tell me if I'm totally way off base.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about the mixed faith couples or the homosexual kids with their believing parents, or the I don't know, feminist Mormon housewife, right? That's struggling with depression and her career identity or things like that. And especially if you're thinking about this homogenous bubble, like maybe Utah, Idaho, the Book of Mormon belt, right? Where there's lots and lots of different LDS therapists, even clinics that provide services that quite frankly wouldn't be found or be deemed effective or popular in other areas of the country, like some of these sex addiction clinics, where the Sons of Helaman program, for example, where they take young Mormon boys and encourage them to stop masturbating, and they go through these huge programs and lots of money and time spent on these things. How is that an issue of privilege, in the sense of like within a religious community, when you have LDS therapists or religious therapists, they may not have privilege outside of those communities. In fact, there may not be a lot of, what do I want to say, respect, or there may be a lot of criticism from other professionals. But within the community, where the community trusts the religious privilege per se, is that even the term that am I even using that correct? Do you have religious privilege in an LDS community as an LDS therapist practicing in certain LDS sanctioned ways, that you would not have that privilege outside of that community, but in the community itself, it's having quite an impact? I'm not
Yeah.
sure I'm saying this very well.
Well, no, I mean, the word is being used right because, yeah, I mean, an LDS therapist in the community has a lot of power to make decisions and to direct clients in their lives of what they should do. And there's an overlapping privilege as well of just like Judeo-Christian religions, Christian Protestant religions in America. That's like what our nation was founded on. And so we see like folks that step outside of that are not treated very well. So there's that as well. But yeah, so I mean, this is the first thought that came to my mind as you were talking, just that on a more simplistic basis, there's privilege in thinking heterosexuality is the only one right way to be. And that comes with a lot of, you have to work pretty hard to like, especially now, like with identity politics and anti-discrimination laws and same-sex marriage. You have to work pretty hard to like avoid and block out this new and upcoming paradigm that like there's nothing actually wrong with being queer. So blocking that out, yeah, you're more able to do that in more insular communities, because this privileged way of being that like has a lot of history of being heterosexual has a lot of traction still in the United States, a lot of support, and it's powerful, and it's a privilege to, you know, operate and live and identify in the world of heterosexuality. I guess like this goes back to, I think, one of the main findings of my research was that these journeys that these folks went on, and that like a lot of the folks that I know who go on these privilege awareness journeys and their lives change pretty dramatically, it all kind of goes back to one main theme of relationships. So like there are, in all these stories that I gathered, there are key relationships that influenced all of these experiences and all of this change that these folks went through. Those, you know, like for example, just having a family member who was who identified as queer, or a close friend who, if you're white, who identified as a person of color. These relationships impacted people so much because it was like they saw the person for who they were, a human being. And then, like, once it got to that point in the relationship, then they could see how they were treated very, very differently. And I think, unfortunately, like, those of us with privilege rely on the oppression of others to wake up, because how else would we do it if we live life comfortable with like how the world treats us? So my mind goes to that because I'm thinking of folks in the communities that you're talking about right now. And I think the question comes, what would have to happen for a paradigm shift to occur? And then I think, well, it's relationships. You have to have a close relationship with someone who is experiencing the world very differently than you are. I'm not sure that answers your question per se, but like it's what comes to mind because I've like felt myself get very discouraged when I think about these experiences, like of queer youth still like being raised in a society and in a community where they themselves believe that the way they are is not good, is not right. And it's discouraging to think of. And then the like shimmer and glimmer of hope is that technology and the way the world is going gives more access to those folks of seeing people who are just like them.
Who are accepting of themselves and things of that
Yeah.
nature. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to take your work and make it applicable to people's lives, right? So I guess what I'm thinking is, if you're listening to this for whatever reason, you know, you're thinking about, okay, if I myself want to go see a therapist, is privilege awareness something that I should be thinking about when I
Yeah.
choose a therapist? Depending on, and since this is a Mormon audience, depending on my relationship with Mormonism and or the relationship that this therapist has with Mormonism, what are some potential things I should be thinking about there? And I guess the last thing, which we haven't covered a whole lot, but I think a lot of your points make it clear that we all have room to um, be enhanced by privilege awareness in our own lives as a goal or value that we prioritize. And like what you're saying, you have to be intentional about it. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just going to happen unless you're rubbing into these ways where other people are already suffering because you are witnessing it, and that's what awakens you. Because if you're a person in a privileged position, you're probably not going to be bothered by it naturally because that's, like you say, that's the whole nature of privilege, is that you don't really notice. It's kind of like a fish in the ocean. You're not going to notice that you're surrounded by water.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to go about either educating yourself, knowing kind of some of the themes, being woke in the sense of being open to ideas that kind of rub you a little bit rough or
Mm-hmm.
different, and not
Mm-hmm.
just dismissing them because they rub you wrong.
Right.
And that through that process we actually grow and have deeper relationships with the people in our lives, or maybe our wards or our stakes or our world community, our, our world organization, which is, this kind of global church now that we are all a part of.
I'm glad you mentioned that last part, because one finding in the literature on this talks about the deficits that privileged folks with coming from privileged groups and dominant identities has, that being unaware of our privilege and not really seeing it or realizing it often can result in superficial relationships with folks that identify differently than we do. This was particularly applicable for those who racial differences.
Mm.
That superficial relationships can often occur when there's just no sensitivity or understanding of the different ways people are treated based on skin color. But that's what typically what it means is a white person can't see that. If they're friends with someone who's a person of color, and The Hate U Give, the movie and the book based on the book, showed this really well. The main character, the African American adolescent girl, is in the car with her white boyfriend, and he says, I don't see black, I see you. And she's like, if you don't see my blackness, you don't see me. It was a great depiction of what the research shows about these feeling kind of superficial in these relationships. The more we, and really what this means to me is the more we do our work, we don't rely on marginalized communities to teach us, but we go out and we seek literature, and internet has plenty of resources. The more we do our work, the more sensitized we are to how the world's structured in a very unfair way, and we benefit a lot from that. The more balanced the more authentic those relationships can be, because we see the struggle. We understand why the struggle exists and why we benefit from that. And there's more authenticity there. There's more connection there, because we're owning a lot of that stuff. But if we don't own it, it's, for folks who aren't in the dominant group, it's pretty frustrating.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it brings people together. I think that's what it ends up doing, to your point. And then going back to your original point about maybe what to do if you're trying to find a therapist. Typically, the language that folks use in their bios and is kind of some indicator of that, but also it helps to, like I said, if you're on this journey yourself, or if you're a therapist or you're just an individual thinking about how to go about this, how to open myself up to learning, I would say prioritize seeking resources on your own. It's very easy to find things online, to find books and resources. Because I think often marginalized groups and individuals feel like they take the brunt of having to educate folks. Right. And it's not the most fair thing to do.
Another burden.
Yeah, right.
Another burden, right. Okay, so I've had you on for a while, so my next question is, kind of wrap us up with final thoughts, obviously, about your work and what you really loved about it, or what you feel like you learned most from it. And, or, am I not asking a question that you had hoped I would ask, as far as anything you'd want to share that I wasn't insightful enough to bring up?
Well, I guess in wrapping up, I would say that I was pleasantly surprised, and surprised that I was surprised, of how important relationships are to all of this. Because I don't know, I think that the progressive and liberal culture of wokeness and identity politics can get tribal very quickly, and which has a tendency to make folks who are on the fence and maybe just not in the know-how of how to navigate this new world, can make folks in that situation feel very put off and shamed to the point of not wanting to kind of dive in and do their own work and self-confront. And so what this all means, I think, to me is we need to make this idea of privilege awareness and becoming just more sensitive to oppression, privilege, and power in society. We need to make that more accessible to folks. And the more we use tactics like shame or shunning, the worse off we are, I think. And that's hard. Like, that's not an easy thing to do. But I think it's what I've really found with how these folks talk about why it was they did the work that they did. That's like
Well,
central, I think.
yeah, no, and I love that. And I think this is just a super important topic. And I hope people are willing to listen about this. I think your research that individuals like you are doing are phenomenal. So thank you so much for first of all, I guess just being interested in this topic enough to do a dissertation on it and then to bring it to our awareness here. So thank you so much for that. I just want to again remind people that Jimmy is going to be one of the hosts here at Mormon Mental Health. I hope that you find him as thoughtful and caring and wise and just insightful as I do. So I am super excited to see what kinds of interviews you bring to the show. And I know that you're well connected, just kind of in your academia world and things. So I'm really excited to see who you're going to invite on. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself, just from a practice perspective? You do see clients, so people who want to see you or feel comfortable with your style, et cetera. I'd want to make it very easy for them to find you. And maybe if you want to talk a little bit about some of the types of issues you enjoy seeing in your private practice.
Yeah. So because my clinical training is in couple and family therapy, I think a lot about issues folks have in terms of relationships. So I ask clients a lot about relationships that they have and the issues that they have within their families and relationships, and that has involved a lot of a lot of my work has been with couples, with parenting. I've also worked a lot with couples on when there's issues that are related to gender inequality, or any of those issues. But also a lot of my work has been with men as well, and kind of breaking down any harmful kind of messages of like toxic masculinity that really get in the way of connecting with the people that we love. That's been like a big part of what I do. And having background and experiences in like things like community mental health and domestic violence advocacy, premarital services, and things like that. I see like a pretty wide range of issues, but those are kind of my expertise. And with like trauma sensitive and queer affirming services, I guess I would call myself in the therapeutic setting. I try to be warm, transparent, and really focused on kind of what present issues folks are dealing with. And as much as the past is applicable to the present, it comes in. I like to talk about how the past influences how we're doing these days, but only to the point that it's comfortable and applicable to clients. So I like to let clients kind of lead in that and determine what goals they want to work on.
Well, thanks. I have found you again, nothing but wonderful, and in having you as part of Symmetry Solutions, and so glad you're a part of our team. So if you're interested in either seeing Jimmy professionally or reaching out as far as more information about his dissertation, and or have further questions in regards to this interview, etc., please feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you to him. I'll also make sure and put a link to your personal kind of webpage and things like that on this as well. So thanks so much, Jimmy, for your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.
I loved it, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, as I hope everybody else does as well. And remember too that if you feel like this is a valuable resource to help us out by either becoming a regular donor, a monthly donor, even a one-time donor would be great. Of course, share on social media our resource, as well as give us a positive rating if you so think we deserve. So thanks for all that, Jimmy. You have a good night.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,